Welcome to My Hometown, the program that explores clubs, organizations, businesses, and issues across Nassau and Suffolk counties and sheds light on the different towns that are making a difference.
Hello and welcome to My Hometown. I'm Bill Horan, along with my co-host, Stacy Raine.
Bill, today we are going to learn all about Raynham Hall Museum, a place that connects you to the complex and evolving story of our nation through the lens of one revolutionary household, the Townsend Family Home, located on West Main Street in Oyster Bay.
Our guests today are Christopher Judge, their Director of Visitor Services, and Justinne Lake-Jedzinak, their Director of Education and Public Programs.
Christopher and Justinne, welcome to My Hometown on the voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC.
Okay, let's start. We want to learn more, so tell us about Raynham Hall Museum.
Well, Raynham Hall Museum is the home of a spy for George Washington. He was Culper Jr. in the spy ring. And it wasn't until the 1930s that it was discovered by a Long Island historian, Morton Pennypacker, who worked with several handwriting specialists to discover that the family suspicion that Uncle Robert had something really important to do in the American Revolution was proven when Pennypacker matched up handwriting samples from Uncle Robert and these previously unknown writings by Culper Jr. in the spy ring, and it was determined that it was a match. And from that point on, family members had always been in control of the house, which was the Townsend homestead. And it wasn't until, well, it was the mid-19th century that it got called the Raynham Hall, which was named after another Raynham Hall in England, southeast of London. And at that point, then neighbors in the Oyster Bay community, they started saying, "Oh, you have your own Raynham Hall in America now, don't you?" Because it was such a big, beautiful Victorian villa that they were creating, extending off of the colonial house. And so the name Raynham Hall stuck, but it's kind of just a nickname for the house. I like to think of it as like still the Townsend homestead. And so after the last family members, 2 Weeks sisters, was it, Justine, that were living and working in the house. They tried to run it as a tea house at one point, wasn't so successful. They decided, once it was determined that their Uncle Robert was a spy for General Washington, that they turned the house over to the Daughters of the American Revolution, who tried to run it for themselves for about 20 years, and I guess they found it fiscally unsupportable, and they turned it over to the town of Oyster Bay, who got to purchase it for $1. And since then, now, then in 1953, the organization, the Friends of Raynham Hall, was established. So just last year, we celebrated our 70th anniversary as a public museum. So it's been an exciting journey, I'm sure, for everybody involved over the last several decades.
And so much intrigue.
Yeah, there's a lot of mysteries in there. It's also reputedly a haunted house.
Ooh.
Which we do some historic spirits guides, spirits tours throughout the year.
Yeah. Okay, so this family, they had suspicions that their uncle had been some sort of spy, or it just like one day dawned. I mean, they one day see this handwriting and they're like, wait a second.
Would you like to?
Sure. So I think the family always had their suspicions about Uncle Robert possibly being a spy, but it was never something that was out in the open. And one thing you have to know about the Culper spy ring, organized by George Washington to help win the war, was that none of them were ever caught. So even though some of their identities were known after the war, Robert was very cautious. He was very savvy. Around the time that he's spying, he's actually doing most of his spy work in Manhattan. And he's coming back to the family home in Oyster Bay on holidays and on weekends. And he's listening to conversations that are happening in both places. But when Benedict Arnold becomes sort of the top British spy hunter after he switches sides, Robert becomes even more cautious and worried about his name potentially getting out there. So because the secret identity was such an important part of the ring's success, this is why he kept that his true Robert Townsend self very separate from Culper Jr., the spy. So we think that the family may have, had their thoughts about that, but really it was not at all proven until the 1930s, as Christopher said.
Can you give me a little bit of background about this spy ring? I had not heard of this, so I need to have I need some context here.
Yeah, sure. The Culper spy ring was originally organized by Ben Talmadge. Now, Talmadge had worked for, Justine, do you remember the name of the commander that Talmadge worked for?
No, I can't remember, but no, I'm not sure.
Okay. But Benjamin Talmadge was eventually promoted, and you can see this whole storyline in a TV show by the AMC called Turn, and Turn can still be seen on AMC Plus or I believe on Amazon streaming. But about 3 years into the war, Ben Talmadge started organizing friends of his from Setauket, Long Island. And these were men that he trusted. He knew he could trust because he had grown up with them, gone to school with them. They had been, childhood pals for decades. And he starts organizing his friends because he knows that in order to stay one step ahead of the British at all times, they're going to need information. And so they start organizing themselves with the tacit support of Washington, to start engaging and observing troop movements out in Setauket, across the Long Island Sound, which was then called Devil's Belt, all the way across to Connecticut and back to wherever Washington was stationed. But one of the spies, Abraham Woodhull, who originally had the name of Culper, he was traveling into his sister's boarding house, which was in Manhattan, and collecting information about troop movements, any other information that he could gather. But he knew that eventually it was becoming more and more perilous for him to travel on these dirt roads. After the end of the Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn, as some people call it, all of Manhattan and all of Long Island were occupied by the British. So if you were still on Long Island, you were behind enemy lines. And it was becoming more and more dangerous for Woodhull to be traveling these dirt roads along what today is Route 25. And there were roadblocks along the way. So they would always be asking, what's your business? Show us your papers. What validity do you have in making these journeys back and forth? He knew that it was getting more and more dangerous, and he knew that he had to find somebody who lived and worked in Manhattan. And at his sister's boarding house, who else was renting a room but Robert Townsend? And somehow they got to talking, and he eventually persuaded Robert to join the spy ring. At first, Robert was probably thinking to himself, I don't want to become another Nathan Hale and end up hanged to death for getting caught by the British. I'm in the kitchen, essentially, of the battle with the British. And so, but eventually he was persuaded. His father was a member of the New York Provincial Congress, strong patriot leanings, in the family already. And his father had signed the New York copy of the Declaration of Independence. So soon after, within a few months, even his father would come to be arrested, later bailed out by another wealthy merchant in Oyster Bay. But Robert Townsend, he had those, that something rose up in his heart to say that I'm going to do something for, the part of hopefully our new country. What we're aiming for, and he knew that information would help the cause like no other effort.
Yeah, courageous.
Is there an exhibit today or a unique artifact that's being shown that is currently shown to the public concerning this period?
Sure. Well, one of the things we haven't touched upon yet with the Townsend homestead, or Raynham Hall, is that it was also a site of slavery. So Samuel Townsend, as Christopher mentioned, is a member of the New York Provincial Congress. He's strongly fighting for the cause of independence, and yet he continued to enslave people. So up to 20 people overall, and at least 12 at a time. And his son, Robert Townsend, the spy, actually joins the Manumission Society to try to end slavery. So even within the family, there are differing ideas about liberty and freedom and who that applies to. So I think one of the really special objects in our collection is the Townsend Slave Bible. So we acquired it in 2005 at an auction. And what it does is it records the names and some of the life dates of the enslaved people who lived in the Townsend home. Now, not everyone is included in it. There are about 17 names and some dates. And you also see handwritten in the slave Bible, little notes and information that really are all that remain that we can say about the people who lived in the Townsend home who were enslaved in many cases. So, for example, if someone was the child of another, if they had brothers or sisters, if they had a partner, that the Townsend Bible has that information. And we think that this Bible may have also been used as proof when New York does end slavery of the dates of birth and the relationships of the enslaved people so that they could ultimately be freed.
Justinne, I'm just thinking, when you're talking about that Bible, was this something somebody found at a garage sale and got for $1.50, or was it understood to be a treasured item and, a collector's item? Do you know? Yes. So when it went up for auction, and hopefully it's okay with our collections manager if I say this, she doesn't like me sharing how much we paid for it, but it was $10,000. And we were actually, several historians had contacted us and said, this object that's going up for auction, you really should buy it because it will complete a lot of your story.
Right. So, So tell us when visitors come to Raynham Hall, what are the things that they can see, they can learn about, of this area, of the Revolutionary War, of the enslaved people who were there?
Well, the first thing they see when they walk into our visitor center, they're struck by the image of 4 portraits up on the wall that people often comment about how beautiful they are. But 3 of the 4 portraits are technologically created. They're artists' interpretations of what people might have looked like because we don't actually have portraits of the father of the family, Samuel Townsend. Mm-hmm. We don't have a portrait of Robert Townsend, the spy. Only a pencil drawing was ever done by one of his nephews when Robert was in his 60s, a side profile that really gives you no information about what Robert might have looked like. Mm-hmm. And the 4th portrait is of an enslaved woman, Elizabeth, or as she was nicknamed, Liz. And no portraits were ever done of enslaved people.
Right.
They were considered property. I mean, I won't make any comments or jokes about it, but about who or what we make portraits of today. But it was important for us to have representation there immediately upon entry. The 4th portrait that I'm mentioning that was an actual real portrait of somebody was Colonel John Graves Simcoe. And even that portrait is technologically age regressed, down from his wild Einstein-like hair, and I'm sure there was some wrinkles removed. So it's made to look like the time that he was actually there in his 20s. But so these introduce you to what we have is an augmented reality experience that we give you equipment like a smartphone and headphones, and you get to go through the entire visitor center and then other parts of the property. But once you get past those 4 portraits, then you're introduced to several dioramas, 2 giant dioramas, one of which was in the New York Historical Society Museum, and they're coordinated and created by one of our board members, Richard Schuster, who is really an expert artist at these miniature figurines. So there's also interactive aspects to our displays. We have a ship's wheel that children and adults alike can turn and turn a model ship and see the type of ship that the Townsends would have had. We have a flipping the narrative wall that has actually panels that flip over to show you 2 images, one of which is an exemplary image of a wealthy colonial family, and then enslaved people working in front of a hearth in a kitchen on the other side. There's even a letter, an original letter by Alexander Hamilton that was transcribed from George Washington's message to the then New York governor asking for more troops. So even though I'd say the Hamilton letter is probably more valuable than what Justinne mentioned as the Slave Bible. The Slave Bible definitely has more. It's just more a more interesting piece.
I'm going to take a minute to remind our listeners that you are listening to My Hometown on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Stacy Raine, here with Bill Horan, and today we are learning about the Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay. And our guests are Christopher Judge, their Director of Visitor Services, and Justinne Lake-Jedzinak, their Director of Education and Public Programs.
Running a museum, how do you know? Does people come to you and say, gee, you may want to go upstate New York? They have some historical item or artifact that would be perfect for the museum? Or do you just, historians just kind of mention it to you? Or is it an organized process, finding new objects for the museum or new parts of history?
Sure. I think for a museum of our size, since we're pretty small and regional, and yet we tell this national story of the American Revolution, we do have people contacting us. Townsend descendants still exist, and they will actually offer artifacts from their family that may have been in the family since the time of our Townsends and in the late 1700s. Other times, just as with the Townsend Slave Bible, artifacts will come up at auction that could be of interest to us. We were actually recently in a bidding war for something that we did not successfully acquire. But I would say it's really a mix of all of the different ways that you mentioned. And then other times, we do have the occasional artifact found in somebody's boiler room in their basement. So we have actually a blacksmith's account book from the late 18th century, which connects back to the story of slavery, and that there are records there of somebody fitting a pair of iron shackles onto an enslaved person. So it's a horrible part of the story, and yet it was something that went untold for decades, even centuries, because it was in somebody's basement and then was recently rediscovered and then given to the museum. So really, in all of the ways that you said, we have acquired objects.
That must be, to me, it's a very interesting part, just how that would come. And probably some of it is just pot luck. Someone walks in and says, would you like this? Or what's this worth to me? Or something like that, I guess. So
I can imagine coming into the museum is extraordinarily interesting and for reasons like you just said, extraordinarily difficult things to process.
Yeah, and partly because the museum talks about multiple generations of the Townsend family. I mean, you can experience parts of the Townsends' various generations, starting from all the way back from 1739 all the way through essentially 1920s. So it's a huge time span. Okay. And in somewhat we're constricted with space, and we have to do our due diligence to tell those stories effectively. From all the way ranging from women's liberation and voting rights, through the development of a new country, through the abolition of slavery in New York State and other states around our new country. So there's just so many stories to tell, and visitors often have no more than 90 minutes of a guided tour to be told those stories, and then some of their own exploration if they decide to stick around the visitor center.
That's so many interesting. By the way, for someone listening, when is the museum open? The hours of the day when someone comes, do they have to make an appointment? Do they get tickets ahead of time?
Oftentimes, guests don't need to, except for the summertime when we're definitely busier, but guests often don't need to make a pre-reservation. We're open Tuesdays through Sundays from 1 to 5 p.m., and we alternate the types of tours that we do. So Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, we offer self-guided tours utilizing that augmented reality technology that I mentioned before. And then Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, we have guided tours at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Now, certainly if a group wants to organize a private tour, oftentimes we have about 5,000 students that come in per year, but they usually do their tours in the early mornings, but we can arrange for a special group tour even in the afternoon or a weekend if need be.
I was about to ask if schools came along to the museum, so yes. I'm guessing a little bit older of school children because...
Yeah, and it's really wonderful because I recall my childhood. I didn't learn, and so many of our visitors too, who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s, they say they didn't learn about the the history of the American Revolution that was happening here on Long Island in our own backyards.
Right.
And now kids are getting that knowledge, and they're going to be able to take that, and it's going to help grow our national story, our national involvement, in the American Revolution, as those children go and go to other parts of the country and the world, and other people hear those tales.
Yeah, it seems like a really cool place to come and just learn about all of these really big historical happenings of our history. That sounds like a really cool place to visit.
So there's something called Standing Where They Stood. What does that mean?
Sure. This is actually our slavery tour, where typically it's covered in the 5th grade curriculum. So we'll have 5th graders do it, but we've also had requests from teachers and adult groups. As Christopher mentioned, we can organize private tours to also do the Standing Where They Stood tour, which is really about slavery and freedom in Oyster Bay. So it's an opportunity to walk in the same footsteps that people who were enslaved in the Townsend home would have walked. Our front door is original to 1741. So we always say if doors could tell stories, our front door would have many to tell, and many enslaved people walked in and out of it. So we kind of share the story as they get to go through the physical spaces of the house. We do have a room that's interpreted as the slave sleeping quarters, so where the enslaved would have rested, although we don't overemphasize that because they wouldn't have spent much time resting, but we show, the other spaces where they would have worked. They would have been expected to keep the fires going, to work in the kitchen, to do all of this labor in the house throughout the day. And we also invite them to speak the names of the enslaved that we learned from the Townsend Slave Bible. And each of them is actually given an identity card, and they tell some of the stories that we do know about individuals, their skills, what kind of work they did, and their family connections, too.
Very interesting.
I'm going to take a minute to remind our listeners once again that you are listening to My Hometown on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Stacy Raine here with Bill Horan, and today we are learning about the Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay. And our guests today are Christopher Judge, their Director of Visitor Services, and Justinne Lake-Jedzinak, the Director of Education and Public Programs.
Can you tell us, when people come into the museum, what's the aha moment when, like the little kids, and I'm talking about grammar school, so not tiny little, but is there something there that fascinates them that they all gravitate to, or you hear them talking about on the way out?
I'd say it's either spies or pirates.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay.
You're either going to get captured and or worse, at the high seas, or you're going to try to figure out mom and dad's passwords to all their computers and devices. And we teach some of the kids some techniques that how the spies communicated.
Oh my gosh!
Not necessarily that we're getting into cracking codes, of passwords on modern devices, but certainly the ways that the spies communicated. That to this day, scientists still don't understand. For example, the invisible ink that was used between Robert Townsend and George Washington. That they still don't understand what chemicals were involved. They haven't been able to recreate that. So it's pretty fascinating that we say to kids. Or even the Agent 355, who in the Talmadge code book, that was one of the code numbers that was used to represent the word lady. And so there might have been a lady involved in the Culper spying.
Oh,
Historians are still trying to break that story. They're actively investigating who that lady might have been. It might have been Anna Strong from Setauket. It might have been Elizabeth or Liz from Raynham Hall. It might have been one of the Townsends, the daughters of the family. But if any of the students, we encourage them. If any of you are into history and you crack that code, you're probably going to become very rich and famous because you'll get a made-for-TV movie or a full-length feature movie made about that story.
Stacy, you have 3 kids. Can't you get them working on
well,
this?
This is what I was just thinking.
Rich.
That's why I'm at. Like, what grades come in to explore the museum? Because I'm thinking, my 10-year-old would be all about trying to crack some codes, but I would be terribly afraid to bring my toddler in for fear that he would break something extraordinarily valuable.
I would say, we're pretty all ages friendly. So we tend to kind of try to create the experience that works best for all ages. In terms of our school visits, because of the curriculum and where we think the students would sort of best be learning from the museum, it's 4th and 5th grade. So right around the age of your children. And definitely the pirates are a huge takeaway. And one thing that I'm not sure if we mentioned at the beginning, but Samuel Townsend really made his money as a merchant. He owned 5 ships, and one of his ships is stolen by privateers, and he never gets it back. So that's a story that the kids love hearing when they come in.
Tell us some of the things that we're taping the show now in the fall. What is coming up in the next few months that people hearing the show may want to come over to the museum to see? Are there any special events?
Yeah, probably the most popular event that we have throughout the year is our annual Ghost Walk. It's a Halloween parade through Oyster Bay, and it's supported by Town of Oyster Bay. And last year we had about 1,000 people attending, some marching with us, some just standing along the sides observing. But certainly it's a great event to bring the community together. Probably, aside from the Oyster Festival, probably the biggest event in town that is not exclusively for Oyster Bay community members, but that's mostly who shows up. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the parade, we have a dance party and the whole entire event is free and open to the public. We will have food vendors with food and beverages for sale, and it's just a great time. We have stilt walkers. We have these giant puppets that are internally lit that have the faces of historic Townsend family members on them. So there's a real spooky aspect to it. But then it all culminates back at a municipal parking lot right next to Raynham Hall. And it's a great time had by all. It's pretty boisterous.
I have a feeling you're going to get a request from our station director, Sean Novat. I have a feeling he's going to have us out there with microphones interviewing people. Are you a ghost or are you a real person? And how long have you been hanging out here as a ghost? What does a ghost do in their spare time? These are the questions we're going to have to ask. So get ready for this, because I'm sure you're going to be hearing from him.
Absolutely.
Wrapping up, tell us, is there anything we should know about, and of course our audience, Raynham Hall Museum?
Well, we have a Townsend Talks series. Justine, you want to explain a bit about that?
Sure. We have it's a lecture series that we have, but it's so much more than that. Lecture series makes it sound so staid, but it's really a series of discussions, conversations that connect to Raynham Hall's mission. So it could be on anything from horticulture. Our next one is actually about dance and the language of fan. So in the 1700s, if a lady was interested or not interested in a male suitor, how she might wave her fan in a way to show her interest or lack of interest. We just continue to have talks like that about different subjects. Our last one was on pirates. So we try to engage with our audiences in different ways that might interest them and kind of get them to think about the story that we tell at Raynham Hall.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here with us today. Our guests have been Christopher Judge, the Director of Visitor Services, and Justinne Lake-Jedzinak, the Director of Education and Public Programs at Raynham Hall Museum, located at West Main Street in Oyster Bay. Thanks so much for advising us about this. And you know I'm going to be there for the Ghost Walk. And you know there's going to be 3 little ghosts with Stacy when we show up there. I'd like to let our audience know that I'm Bill Rand. I'm here with Stacy Raine. We thank you for listening to this week's episode of My Hometown.
We like to get your feedback on My Hometown. Send your comments to WHPC at ncc.edu. Nassau Community College, where success starts and continues. Till next time, this is Bill St. James. And remember, there's no town like your hometown.